So when we're talking about primers, there's a lot of different kinds out there and a lot of different types. For regular small pistol loads, you're just going to use standard small pistol primers. I use Winchester. Sometimes I use CCI, depending on what's available and what's cheaper. CCIs are a little bit harder, so if you have a lightened hammer and everything, you might have an issue igniting the CCIs. Winchesters are a little bit softer. Sometimes the Winchesters don't feed in the progressive presses very well. But in either case, for the most part, especially if you're going to be using a single stage press or a turret press, doesn't matter which one you use. So for our 5 example rounds, we're going to need 5 primers. Normally you do it 100, couple hundred, 1,000 at a time. But we're just going to do 5. So they come in rows of 10, so we're just going to plop all 10 in there. It's not a big deal. They come in packs of 100, then 1,000, then 5,000, then however many you want to order. So this is where this little tray comes in handy that we were talking about. Right now all the primers are pretty much already oriented how we want them to be, but for the sake of demonstration, that's going to be oriented incorrectly. We're going to shake a little bit and it's going to pop right over. It's that easy. You just keep on shaking it until they're all facing one way. You put the lid on it, you flip it, you take that back off, and they're all magically facing the direction you want. You're going to take your plucker, you're going to pluck them. Till they're all in there. And that's how you load your primer thing. Very easy, very straightforward. You don't want to put undue stress on it. If something gets stuck or something's not right, don't force it. That's how you set off primers, and that's how this little thing turns into a tiny tube of dynamite. It's unsafe. If you have an obstruction or something in there, do not try to dislodge it by ramming something in there or anything, and that's bad news. Most companies will tell you just to scrap that and they'll send you a new one, or to just buy a new one. If for any reason this gets bent or warped and you store it wrong or something gets in here and it gets lodged, don't try to unjam it. It's just an unsafe situation. I mean, if you got one primer in there, maybe. If you got it halfway loaded, definitely not. That's a lot of explosive in this little tube, and that's a lot of shrapnel coming your way if you set that off. So we got them loaded in here. I'm going to show you how to get them in the priming station, and we'll go from there. So this turret press comes with a proprietary priming system. It's attached to the press and can be mounted right here. It makes it really easy to prime. You can get hand priming tools as well. A lot of beginner kits start with hand priming tools. Those are a little bit more strenuous to use. If you can get a press with an integrated priming system, I'd recommend it. For precision reloading, you're going to want a priming system that you can actually determine exactly how deep your primers are set every single time. For the most part, seating primers is more of a feel thing than an exact science. Do not over force it, or else you will set off that primer and then tiny little pieces of metal will be flying up through here right into your face, and that's bad. But it's a smooth motion that doesn't need a whole lot of force. If it needs a lot of force, that means that you didn't properly remove your crimp or something's obstructing that primer pocket. So I'm going to put my primer tube in here. I'm going to put my cap on it. I'm going to load it up with them primers that we just plugged into here. And they went right into the primer feeding system. I'm going to put my standard case holder in there with a hole in the middle. That's where your primers are going to feed through. Put that into my RAM. Put my first case in there. Push this in there, and now it comes with a primer. You want, obviously, that bottom of the primer to be facing up. Try not to touch the primers, especially if you have case lube on your gloves or something from earlier. It can deactivate the primers and bad things will happen. Keep your primer safe from moisture. That primer material attracts moisture, so I normally keep mine in a file cabinet that is in an area that's not a whole lot of moisture. If you have them for long periods of time and store them, I don't because I go through them very quickly. But if you have them for long periods of time, you're definitely going to want them in a moisture-controlled environment, or else you're going to have issues. So for this particular primer setup, I'm going to raise this a little bit, feed it into there, push back down. It'll automatically feed the primer into there. Pull it up a little bit, and we should have a seated primer. So what you're going to be looking for is you're going to be looking for a high primer. A high primer is when it is further out past the case. That's bad because you can have ignition issues in your magazine. You could have all kinds of problems. If your hammer hits it, maybe it won't go off because it'll push it in farther instead of actually making it go off. You got that issue a lot in 223s that have been improperly decrimped. 9x19 NATO, you can have that issue too, but it's less common. But you don't want to crush primer either. So a lot of these are adjustable by height, and you just kind of adjust to them until they feel right. You want it to be able to feel that it's inside there. You don't want it to be flush, because again, that's going to put you at risk of detonating that primer at an inopportune time when it's in your magazine or something. But you don't need it to be very, very super deep. You can get a feel for it. After you've reloaded enough rounds, you can feel when it's just below that case surface. Even with your gloves on, you can actually feel that little divot, especially if you use the thin gloves like I do. But you're really looking for any kind of deformations in the surface of that primer or anything that would indicate that you pressed that a little bit too hard. For the most part, it's pretty straightforward process, and it's kind of hard to mess up unless you did something wrong setting it up in the first place, which it's very easy to set up. Most priming systems are just plug and go. But priming does not take long at all. So here, I'm going to prime another one. Good. Give it a feel. Good. Give it a feel. Make sure it's not crushed. Good. Give it a feel. Make sure it's not crushed. And good. Give it a feel. Make sure it's not crushed. And there's our 5 example cartridges, primed and ready for expanding and powder. So for this next step, we're going to be putting a flare on the cartridges. Technically, you can also charge them in this step with powder. We are not going to do that at this point. That's why most of these are through and through. You're going to need an expander die. You need that with the straight weld cartridges to put a little bit of flare on there so that you can get that bullet on there when you're ready to load the bullet for the bullet process. So in order to do that, you're going to raise your ram all the way. You're going to take your die, you're going to screw it in all the way until it touches. All the way until it touches. Still not touching. There we go. Now you're going to back it off just a little bit, just so that it's not over camming. Because unlike the full-length sizing die, you don't want to over cam this one. So now, I'm going to pop the case in here, put it up through, and see how it turns out. So here, if I get close enough, hopefully you can see it, there will be a little tiny, barely noticeable flare on that case. You see how that mouth is a little bit wider than it was before? That's exactly what you want. You don't need an aggressive flare. You don't need a ridiculous flare. You just need enough to be able to get that bullet in there so that the sides of this case don't grab onto that bullet when you're trying to get it in there. You don't want it to pull on that bullet. You want it to hold that bullet. So you just need enough of a flare to get that started, get a nice little curve in there so that when that bullet seats, the edges of this ain't catching onto that bullet and causing all kinds of havoc. Any extra friction that you have in there is lost velocity and more pressure. So no reason for that. So we're going to go ahead and flare our 5 example rounds. It's that easy. No bells and whistles here. You can hear that they stick a little bit on the way out. Doesn't take a whole lot of force at all though. Nothing too crazy. Now you're going to want that flare a lot more aggressive on a progressive press like this one, because it's going to automatically drop that bullet in there and you're not going to be placing the bullet in there. But when you're using a single stage or a turret press, you don't need an aggressive bell on there at all. You can just pop that bullet in there and be ready to go. Like I said, during that step, what you could do as well is keep that ram all the way at the top as it's expanding. Have a little funnel up here and put your charge in there if you're going to pre-measure your charges using one of these. That's not what I do. I've always just charged it directly from the powder dispenser. If you're loading precision, you want to measure each and every powder charge. If you're loading bulk pistol ammo, as long as you have a good reliable powder measure with a micrometer, you should be able to get relatively consistent load charges on there within 1/10 of a grain. As long as they're within 1/10 of a grain within safety areas, then it should be working fine for you. So typically, I will just charge them very, very simply like that. Alright, so now we're going to be charging our cases. So when we charge our cases, we're going to first set our powder measure to dispense the right amount of powder. So in this case, we're going to go with 3.2. So we're going to set it to 0 with our tray to measure our powder charges. We're going to get our first powder charge. And already that looks like way too much because that was just a guesstimate. And yep, we're at about 7.8. So we're going to go ahead and put that one back. We're going to tighten down our powder dispenser quite a lot. So we need about half that. And we're going to try again. Make sure all the powder's out of there before you get to the next one, because a tenth of a grain of powder is not a whole lot. Now we're going to check the next one. And that doesn't look like enough. No, we're still just a little high. And right there should probably be just about doing it. Put that one back. This step is all trial and error. You're going to keep on testing it. Once you have a few in a row of the right grain, you should be good to go. But it's all trial and error until then. I haven't loaded pistols on this press for a very long time, so I kind of forget where on this powder dispenser 3.2 grains is, because normally I'm loading a whole lot more than that with my 308s on this thing, because I don't even use it for 223 anymore. So bear with me for a moment while I calibrate it. It's a little bit too much, so we're at 3.7. We're dialing it in. We're going to bring it down 0.5 according to the micrometer, which this micrometer is designed to measure rifle powder, not pistol powder. So it might not have the grains exact, because pistol powder is a lot different. So now we're at 3.3. We're going to go down 0.1 more. Once we get 3.2 for a couple throws, or give or take 0.1, because I'm not too picky, we should be good to go. So there we have a 3.4, so we're going to reduce it by a little bit more again. And plus or minus 0.2 on these kind of powder dispensers is normal. When you precision reload, you're going to do what's called a trickle charge. You're not doing the whole powder charge at once. That's perfect. You're doing a little bit, you're doing the most of it at once, and then you're trickling in a grain at a time, less than a grain actually, like a kernel of powder at a time, until you get to exactly where you want to be in your setup. So that one's still a little bit high. So we're going to keep tuning it down until we get pretty consistent with our 3.2s to 3.4s. See, that one's way low. That one's at a 2.9. Normally this takes about 10-12 times. If you have an exact powder measure like I do on this other one, it takes a lot less time. Or if you're using an actual micrometer system designed for your pistol powder, that's couple have been perfect. So I think we're pretty much ready to charge some rounds. You want to charge and measure every single one when you first start, especially if you're unfamiliar with your powder measure. I must tell you that this one will consistently throw plus or minus 0.2, just because that's always what it's done. So when I do precision loads, I always do 3 to 0.4 below the powder that I want, so that I can trickle charge it up. For pistols, I'm not too worried about it. Max pressure is not going to be an issue because I'm loading well below max power factor, and it'll be pretty much where it needs to be powder-wise to get that bullet out of that barrel as much as I need it to be. Remember, you don't need to push speed and reloading. There's no reason to overcharge your cartridges or push to the max limits. Some people like to do that. If you want to go gung-ho and try that, it's up to you. Remember, the more pressure you're working with, the more likely you're going to have a catastrophic malfunction and have issues. So typically, since I download for competition shooting, I'm looking at the least amount of recoil and the most consistent. You usually get that for the lower to middle end of the pressure spectrum. When you're using too much pressure, you'll get too many inconsistencies. So we're going to go ahead and charge 5. I'm not going to be here every time. Is to look it out there and make sure you got the loader in there. That's another thing that can go wrong in these aggressive presses. If you don't catch that, you could have a couple hundred rounds with no powder in it. You didn't even know it. So you got to make sure you look in there. Make sure you got powder in there. All these have powder in them. So we will be going to the next step.